Good morning. Hope you're having a great Sunday morning as we come together to worship our God here in our house churches. Today is our third lesson in our Exodus series. This is a video for our house church Sundays, and I hope that it will be an encouragement to you and you'll continue to get so much out of our series about how God chose Israel and set them apart to be a special people for Him, just as He chooses us today as Christians to be a special, set-apart people. And so we're going to go ahead and dive on in. We're going to be doing Exodus chapter 2 today. And, what we're really going to be looking at is to see how Pharaoh intensifies the persecution against the Israelites, specifically the baby boys, and what's going to be the response of one desperate mother, and then what that produces in the rest of the chapter in terms of an examination of faith and how we can have it and what it produces. And so we're going to go ahead and dive on in. And just as a brief recap, at the end of chapter 1, Pharaoh's made this decision to have the midwives kill the baby boys as they're being born. But the midwives resist, and so the baby boys continue to be born and grow up. So then Pharaoh switches his decree to have all infant boys killed or thrown into the Nile. It says this in Exodus chapter 1, verse 22. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let the girls live. And so today we're going to dive on in and see what happens the next day after that decree, or even a few days later. And so Exodus chapter 2, we're going to read verses 1 through 8 here. It says, "Now a man of the house of Levi married a Levite woman. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what was going to happen. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to go get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. 'This is one of the Hebrew babies,' she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse it for you?' 'Yes, go,' she answered. And the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you.' So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she became her son. And she named him Moses, saying, 'I drew him out of the water.'" So what did Moses' mother feel when she found out she was pregnant? I mean, most of the time, there's this joy and elation of going to have a child. And yet here, there had to be, in the pit of her stomach, fear. Please do not let it be a boy. Let it be a girl. I can't bear the thought of my child being killed. What am I going to do? How am I going to make it and be right by God and not be destroyed myself by Pharaoh? Her choices were limited. And yet, as we see here, when Moses was born, she took him and she did the best she could. She hid him for, looks here, 3 months, because she did the best that she could do with the faith that she had at the moment. But it got to the point where she could no longer hide him. And so what's she going to do? Well, in this case, she builds him a little micro ark, a little basket, and she coats it so that it's waterproof and will be able to set it in the water. And we're going to put it in the Nile. Now, there's a lot of reasons why you would look at this plan and go, this is not a good plan, because the basket could tip over, it could drown, a crocodile could get it, or any another of the other wild animals that are in the Nile area. He could just be swept down the river. This is not the best plan that you would make if you were trying to keep your child safe. And yet she's desperate. What is she going to do? And so she says, I'm going to do the best that my faith can. And I think sometimes we are looking to have this epic faith in our life that will move mountains, instead of just taking the faith that we have and acting on it. Sometimes we don't see how it's going to work, but if we just take that small mustard seed of faith that Jesus so famously talks about and go, okay, what can I do? In this case, she did the best her faith could do, which is like, okay, I'm going to put him in, it's at least going to keep him alive a little bit longer. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe he'll be rescued by some other peoples further down the river. Maybe she thought that an Egyptian might rescue him. Who knows what was going through her mind. She's like, I got to give him a chance. Let me do the best that faith can do, not just give up in a hopelessness. And so I think for us, what is the best our faith can do? Some days, that's all we can do is offer a desperate prayer. Some days we're making the desperate plan that's all that we could see. Maybe, ideally, sometimes we can be getting advice about what can we do in a difficult situation. But the one thing that desperate faith does is it looks to God to find an impossible answer in an impossible situation. Because God specializes in coming through in the impossible times. Our job is to keep putting our faith back in God, not looking at all the reasons why something can't be done, but seeing, hey, how God can work. What can he do? What is the step that I can take towards this? We don't even have to see how it's all going to play out. In fact, a lot of times we won't see how it all plays out. That's where the faith factor comes in. We're trusting God that if I take this step, this small step will make a difference. And so here in this case, she depends on God as best she can and builds this little micro ark. I think often one of my favorite accounts in the Bible is of Gideon in Judges chapter 6. And the angel of the Lord goes down and calls him and says, God is with you, mighty warrior. And this is when they're being surrounded by the Midianites and overrun by them and really subjugated by them. And Gideon's like, how can this be? And the angel says, look, it's going to be fine. You're going to lead them. And then the phrase that I love is, go in the strength you have. Go in the strength you have. Go in the faith you have. Do what you can do. Because we all have some level of strength. We all have some level of faith. God rewards those who act in faith. I'm not talking about fantasy island foolishness. I'm saying you've looked it through. You understand, hey, scriptures are involved here. I'm going to do the best I can. God is looking for men and women of faith. Because faith is our power. Faith is I trust in God, not in myself. And so she releases Moses into the river, and we pick up here in verse 11. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew? The man said, who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian? Then Moses was afraid and thought, what I did must have become known. And so we see here that Moses knows that he's a Hebrew. A lot of times in the movies, this is hidden, but it wasn't hidden. Moses knew that he was a Hebrew, and he could look out and see his people. And I think there's a real dilemma. The selfish person would be, man, thank goodness I dodged a bullet. Somehow I got put in Pharaoh's court, and now I can live a life of luxury. That would have been one path he could have gone down. But there appears to be another path he's going down. He's like, wait, these are my people. This is who I am. I want something better for my people. I want something better for those that are akin to me. And so Moses wants something better for his people, but how much of this was because of God? I mean, here he is, he's being raised in an Egyptian household. It says in Acts chapter 7, verse 22, that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. So what does this tell you? He's immersed in the Egyptian culture. He's probably immersed in the Egyptian gods. How much faith does he actually have in God? It seems to be that following God's law is not the primary thing he's focused on here. Because what does he do? It's not working out well, let me just kill this guy. Bury him in the sand. I don't think this is what God was directing him to do, but in his own strength, this is the way he saw to go. Or, I would think, put it another way, had faith in himself. We can have faith in God or we can have faith in ourselves, but faith in ourselves doesn't lead to a biblical plan or a spiritual resolution of things. It leads us into going, okay, what can I do to make this work out? Well, his plan here was to go ahead and kill an Egyptian. Maybe he thought this is going to cause an uprising or people are going to be really excited about it. Of course, this also says, hey, he was afraid that he was found out. So maybe it was just him channeling some rage against the Egyptians and he was hoping nobody would find out. But whatever the case was, he wanted to make a difference, but he went in his own strength. He went with faith in himself. We can believe in good causes, inside the church and outside the church. But just because we believe in a good cause, that doesn't mean we're going to be acting faithfully with God. We can just be having faith in ourselves. This is our own plan to how to fix this. This is our own idea. This is what I should say. This is what I believe should happen. And the world is feeding us all kinds of thoughts all along about how we should act. And if we're not careful, we'll absorb that just like Moses here absorbed the Egyptian thought process. But if we're absorbing the processes of the world, is this really what God intended? God doesn't want us to have faith in ourselves, but faith in Him. Self-reliance produces disastrous results because we are not the source of wisdom. God is the source of wisdom. And when we let that influence our lives, it transforms us. But if we aren't building in faith, then our plan is not done through the will of God's Word. And our plan is not done in dependency on God. Then we end up being like the builder in Luke 6. In verse 49, it says, "But the one who hears my words and does not put them into practice is like a man who has built his house on the ground without a foundation. The moment the torrent struck that house, it collapsed and its destruction was complete." You see, if we're not building on God, we're building on ourselves, and that's building on sand. Moses was building on himself, and it turned out disastrously. In fact, it forces him into exile. And let's continue reading in verse 15. "When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by the well. Now a priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled troughs to water their flocks. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, 'Why are you returned so early today?' They answered, 'An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock.' 'And where is he?' he asked the daughters. 'Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat.' Moses agreed to stay with the man, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. And Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses called him Gershom, saying, 'I have become an alien in a foreign land.' During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them." So Moses is now forced off into the wilderness. And we still see this same kind of crusader element to take care of the weak that we saw back in Egypt when he attacked the Egyptian. And so he comes in and he rescues these daughters, and that leads him to their father, and that leads to him staying there and getting a wife. Now, some people think this priest of Midian, Reuel, or in other places, Jethro, in likelihood was a follower of God. So he was in some sort of spiritual environment. He's there learning, he's growing. He's going to be here for 40 years. God felt like he needed a little time to work on Moses' character before he could send him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And we can look at this, and when we read this, it happens quickly because we just read a few lines, and then all of a sudden, the next time we pick up in Exodus chapter 3, basically Moses is going back. But this is a 40-year period. Often God works on our character for the long haul. Will we have the faith to allow God to work on us in His timing? So often we are impatient. God, will you work it out now? Will you work out my relationship situation? Or will you work out my children's situation? Or my career? Or my finances? Or whatever else it is. We want God to work it out. God, change my character. I'm tired of being this way. Instead of going, okay, how is God teaching me and training me in each moment? What can I grow and learn from? Because so often God is partnering with us. It's not that He comes down and changes us in an instant, but he partners with us to transform our character. And he partners with our life situations. He partners with the suffering that we go through. God will even, along the way, orchestrate some things to change and transform us. A lot of times I believe he's using life as it happens to change us, but God also intervenes. But the big picture, or the big point, is that will you have the faith that allows God to transform your character, no matter how long it takes. God is preparing you for something special. And God's plan includes your strengths and weaknesses. It includes how your sins have impacted you and changed you, and yet he will help you overcome that. It includes hardships of life. It includes the good things you have done. The question you would have is there anyone better to transform you than God? God knows you. God has created you. You know, God has led Moses to an unusual place in this wilderness. He's going to be here for 40 years. That's 40 years of being a shepherd, which is a lot of time for reflection. There's a lot of just making sure nothing's happening to the sheep, but you're just there. You can reflect, you can think, you can pray. A time to mature. A time to look back at how rash decisions influenced him. A time to look back on all he'd learned in Egypt. A time to think about his people. You know, a well-placed faith depends on God and not ourselves. It seeks his will and not our own. It acts in the strength of him, not of ourselves. It waits for God and trusts in his timing. And it builds a life that enters into eternity and has changed eternity by the impact it has on others. You see, the goal for us is a well-placed faith. You know, and I believe that comes from a faith, like we saw with Moses' mother, that will do desperate things with the little faith that she has. We see that it's not to be a faith in ourselves, but to have faith in God and faith in his timing. That it's putting our faith in God. That's the well-placed faith. I pray this morning that this has helped you and that you will work on building a well-placed faith. We have some follow-up questions for discussion here. 3 of the big questions I would have is, why is living by faith so difficult? Another one is, how is it tempting to put more faith in yourself than God? And then lastly, how can we grow our faith even in circumstances that seem like a dead end? I'm going to go ahead and put these up on the screen for you. Maybe you want to pause the video and reference it. And of course, they're in the notes as well. I hope you all have a great day and have a well-placed faith.